I think we'll go ahead and start. So look, hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We just had an extraordinary roll call of people around the world joining. As I said, we've got more than 3,000 people who registered to join us for this conversation. Thank you very much. I'm Dan Thomas. I'm the Chief Communication Officer at the UN Global Compact, and I'm going to be moderating this session. As the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, the UN Global Compact is calling on business leaders everywhere to unite to support workers, communities, and companies affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And today we're pleased to launch this special Academy series of live sessions to provide information, insights, and hopefully some inspiration on how businesses around the world can respond to and recover from the COVID-19 crisis. And every week, every Tuesday from now on, we're going to be hosting a session featuring a panel of leaders from the business world, from the UN, and from government, so that we can share some of the knowledge, the experiences that we're having with our audience. The UN Global Compact, we're also inviting CEOs from our participant companies to record and submit a video sharing their experience, what their company is doing in response to COVID-19 and giving examples. So please do that if you'd like to. And today our speakers, our panelists will discuss the topic of new leadership for a global crisis. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel. We have on the line the CEO of Unilever, Mr. Alan Jobe, joining us from Scotland. Thank you very much. Lisa Kingo, the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. And in just a minute, we'll have the United Nations Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed. She's just having a little moment to connect with us. But let's start off the conversation by asking you all a question. The Secretary General has talked about this extraordinary human crisis that we're in, calling it the greatest test that we've faced together since the formation of the United Nations. That this human crisis demands coordinated, decisive, inclusive, and innovative policy action from the world's leading economies and maximum financial and technical support for the poorest and the most vulnerable of people and countries. So we're facing this extraordinary pandemic with unprecedented social and economic impact. So I'd like to ask you to reflect on the crisis and the impact the impact that this is currently having on your organizations, your staff, and your communities. Alan, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Well, I was listening to your welcome there and all the people who were joining in and from all around the world. I was thinking, my goodness, like a gathering of the United Nations. And then I realized it is a gathering of the United Nations. So it's a pleasure to be here. I think we're all taken aback by the speed and scale and pace of COVID-19's spread. And one of the messages I'm trying to get out to the Unilever team is, unfortunately, this is going to get worse before it gets better. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And once the initial adrenaline and excitement of different ways of working and new challenges has abated, we'll still have many, many weeks, months, maybe quarters and years where we're dealing with either the disease or the aftermath. I'm very concerned about parts of the less developed world. If you look at what's happened in very sophisticated economies, including China, I'm very worried about now what's happening in India, the Middle East, Africa. I heard someone joining from Ecuador, and if our own pattern is anything to go by, Ecuador is really feeling the brunt of this right now. I think in particular, I worry about environments where there's a very poor health infrastructure, And we're starting to take action in Africa. It's the first place we've decided to build our own hospitals, because we think we need to take responsibility for looking after our own employees, because the health system will be quickly overwhelmed. I think on the disappointing side, there's been very little global cooperation around this. Thank goodness we have the various bodies of the United Nations who are banding together, whether it's the Global Compact, or we've had great cooperation with the WHO and other NGOs, because we're not seeing a lot of outreach from global government. This is certainly an inflection point. It's in many ways going to be remembered the way that world wars are remembered. It's a great trauma on the world, and so it'll leave its scars. I have to say, I am an optimist by nature, and even in the thick of this, I do hope that it turns out to be an opportunity to right some of the wrongs in the world. Previously distant challenges, the threat of a plague was a distant challenge for most of the West, in the way that perhaps climate change is seen as a distant challenge. And I think one benefit that will come out of the coronavirus situation is that people will demand that some of these big existential risks for humanity are addressed more impactfully than they have been in the years running up to it, that healthcare systems are upgraded. And then on a closer to home note, I do hope that critical workers, and I'm not just talking about nurses and doctors, although of course they are the heroes of the hour, but supermarket workers, truck drivers, delivery people, teachers get the recognition and reward that those groups deserve in society. So in amongst a lot of difficult moments, I have some hopes that this will be a transition point on some of these big issues for the world.
Thank you, Alan, for those opening reflections. Lisa Kingo, the CEO and the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, my boss. How are you seeing this crisis playing out? What are your reflections on how it's affecting your organization, your staff, the communities that we work in?
Dan, thank you. Well, I think the overwhelming feeling I have is that the world has been turned upside down. And we are in the midst of a very unpredictable situation. And I want to be positive and think about how we can use the learnings that we are getting in many different perspectives these days to calibrate how we are living and working and taking this world forward. So I'm experiencing in my daily work with colleagues at the UN Global Compact and with companies and governments across the world that we are now suddenly, as very social animals, all working from our homes in a very isolated manner. But I think it works remarkably well. I think we are very adaptable, but I also hope that things will change soon again, so we can begin to assume more interaction together. You know, I feel when things are turned suddenly upside down, it's good to go back and look at your roots. And at the UN Global Compact, when we were founded 20 years ago, Kofi Annan coined the 10 principles that are really the core of the entire initiative: human rights, labor, anti-corruption, and the environment. So what we have done in the Global Compact community is to go back to our roots and to do a call for action to all stakeholders, all companies across the world, and ask for everyone to address the pandemic through the lenses of the 10 principles: human rights, anti-corruption, the environment, and of course, the very important labor principles. So I think all our local networks across the world are very busy putting this call into action. And I look forward to sharing some of these concrete examples in the conversations we have now. Because despite we are all meeting great challenges, I think it's encouraging to see how people are coming together in partnerships across the world, finding ways of supporting each other in curbing and moving forward on the pandemic. So I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone for really being very serious in now putting the 10 principles into action in a very different way in addressing the COVID-19.
Thank you, Lisa. And we're pleased that we have the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, on the line as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Amina, at this very, very busy time. We were just kicking off with some opening reflections from our panelists, Mr. Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever, and Lisa Kingo there from the UN Global Compact, on their reflections on the crisis, the impact that it's currently having on the UN, the staff and communities. So why don't you give us your reflections on that?
Thank you very much, Dan, and hello to everyone. It's great to join you. A little glitch in trying to get used to Zoom, which is new for us. But you know, this is an amazing opportunity to connect with so many people and to give some of the current thinking that we have here. For me, as I reflect on this, it's clearly an unprecedented crisis that we haven't had in recent history. It's a global one, and so it requires a global response. And in that, you know, we have to think about our humanity. A lot is unknown. It's evolving really fast. It's really a pandemic that has visited a part of this world that would not normally be the case. And so it really is testing, you know, what we already know, but in reality, we are feeling how interdependent and how connected we all are. I think the good news is that we've never had a time in history either that we have so much in our hands that we can actually co-create and provide the solutions for. So I do see this crisis as an opportunity to do so much more and dig deep and make sure that we are through this, that there is the other side to it, and can we come out of it building better on the things that we probably should have invested in quite a long time ago. Partnerships are going to be absolutely essential. And I think the one word that the Secretary General constantly rams home is solidarity. And it's on different levels, but it is really about us being together and getting through it on very many different levels. You can see that some of the opportunities we took from this crisis was actually to have a call for a ceasefire. Is this a time that we don't just lay down our arms and we really actually think about what is facing us all, and that no one, I mean, COVID-19 does not need a passport. It crosses all borders. It touches all people. So this is a time to lay down arms, and I hope that we will take up that call. It's also a time for lifting sanctions, because those sanctions are much more harmful and don't do what they were set out to do. Today, if those sanctions are still in place, what we will see come across borders again will be undermining our humanity and our ability to cope with it. And so I think that as we think through what we have to offer to go beyond the health crisis, which is absolutely urgent, and WHO doing an amazing job, but to think of the socioeconomic piece, because that piece we'll talk about in a little while, is just as urgent and as deadly to many people who don't know how they will live tomorrow if they don't have an income today. So very much about the response today on health and the socioeconomic piece, and how we recover better. And we do this coming out together, much more unified. And for me, a great time to reflect. I often say that perhaps God has put the world on pause just to do that, and to get us all balanced back up again so that we can, you know, face these challenges that young people are constantly asking us to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. You mentioned the socio-economic impacts. Earlier this week, the Secretary General did issue a report on the global socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. Maybe you can share some of the highlights of that report, and you know, what is the impact of COVID-19 on the gains that we've made and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals?
I think first that no one really expected that in the humanitarian world, it's about saving lives. And so the urgency of that and how we treat it, you see our first responders on the first line. You've seen that now with WHO and the health response, because we need to suppress the transmission of that virus. The things that we need to do to suppress that transmission have caused another challenge, another crisis, which is that taking people out of a human contact for many countries in the north is already a big crisis, but there is a muscle in those countries to put in stimulus packages. You see in the US, 2 trillion goes in to look at small businesses, to help people pay their rents, to give them some income so that they can eat and they can live to fight another day. But when this starts to come down to developing countries and much more vulnerable communities, many of those countries, large swaths of their population are actually in the informal sector. They live day to day. And you're seeing placards go up, which, with people saying, I would rather die from the pandemic than from hunger. That should not be a choice anyone in this world should have to make. We should address both, because both are incredibly urgent. And so what the SG has done is to put out out of the marketplace that we will have to put some attention on some of the resources that will be needed to give cash transfers, to look at kids who are going to be out of school and how we can put them back into the classroom online, to look at water and sanitation, so that we get it to more people, because that's such a critical part of what we're doing. So it's really looking at those fiscal packages, seeing how we can make the space for more liquidity to get these programs up and running and address people who, day to day is their survival, and now they have this pandemic to deal with as well.
Thank you for your answer. Mr. Joe, you lead a major multinational company. You seem to be in as many countries as the United Nations. Over 190 countries, 2.5 billion customers. Describe some of the actions that Unilever is taking to respond to this crisis.
Thanks, Dan. Please call me Alan. Amina, nice to see you again. So first thing I would say is, before we organized our corporate response, I was thrilled at the auto response of our teams on the ground. We were up taking action. Frankly, I know that lots is happening that I don't know about. Our reflex seemed to be in the right area. But we believe in a multi-stakeholder business model, and we have tried to organize a multi-stakeholder response to this. And it's in 5 work streams. It's looking after our people, looking after our communities, looking after product supply, adjusting to new patterns of demand, and protecting our cash. Those are the kind of 5 work streams. On the people side of things, of course, the safety of our employees was the first thing we reacted to, changing how people work in factories to socially distance, upgrade hygiene practices, have our office-based workers work from home, and so on. But as part of that, we protected our workforce and our associates from an immediate drop in pay. We've guaranteed no drop in pay for 3 months for any Unilever employee, and that includes people like the cleaners, the cafeteria workers, the security guards, who often don't work for Unilever, they work for third parties, but those ladies and gentlemen are such an important part of our team that we wanted to offer them a sense of security and stability, at least for 3 months. We can afford to do that. We feel we ought to do that. We quickly worked with the WEF and 1 or 2 UN organizations to make a donation of 100 million euros of product, so that we can supply things like soap and sanitizers and basic foodstuffs. And I'm delighted we've now got about 15 projects up and running in those parts of the world where that will be most needed. We're working with the UK Department for International Development with another 100 million euro commitment to help in society. Then, of course, keeping our factories running, product supply. When you make food, hand sanitizer, soap, which until we have a vaccine is still the front line of defense, we've had to work very hard with government around the world to correct typically an overreaction to shut everything down and thereby restrict the supply of essential products. And then, you know, the world is changing and we have to adjust to new patterns of demand. As you can imagine, tourists are not buying much of our ice cream right now, but we are enjoying an increase in sales of our soap and products like that. And so our response also requires the agility to adjust our product portfolio. Let me be in no doubt, this is no windfall for Unilever. This is going to be significantly damaging for our business. But we have the product portfolio, the financial strength, and the values system to take this multi-stakeholder response to protect some of our small suppliers and partners by paying them quickly to keep them in business. In that regard, I think doing what's right for our business is highly overlapping with doing what's right for society and the world. That's a model we've believed in for a while, and it's going to be tested in this crisis.
Thank you, and it's great to hear that you're working so closely with government as well on this crisis. Lisa, the Global Compact shared a special appeal to companies to work together around the 10 principles. How can the 10 principles help business leaders at this time?
So first, many thanks to Ellen for that very excellent and concrete example of how a company can take responsibility in a situation like the one we find ourselves in. Unilever is clearly among the most advanced companies when it comes to taking action as a corporate good citizen. And many other companies are able to do this as well. But I want to make sure that in this program, we provide guidance for any company, no matter what size it has, because there's something to do for all of us these days. And it's necessary that we all chime in and contribute to the work that the UN, governments, and many more are doing. So then back to the 10 principles. It's actually quite simple. The 10 principles relate to the environment, human rights, labor, and anti-corruption. So let's start in a very simple way by saying, first of all, it's important that all businesses feel that they are part of the solution, that they work in solidarity with the many people across the world that have big challenges these days. Poor people, old people, weak people, women in the global supply chain. So it's important that all companies start by making sure that their own employees are safe and have an opportunity to work at distance from being infected by the COVID-19. So providing safe working conditions. Secondly, to make sure that your global supply chain or your suppliers are also being taken care of. Many of these might be small or medium-sized companies that get into trouble in times like these. So there are many good examples how companies are making sure to maintain their global supply chain, are making sure to pay suppliers in advance and not dragging out the payments, and doing different things to make sure that the supply chain is being kept active.
We've lost your sound for a moment, Lisa. Sound there. We seem to have lost your sound. Lisa, we've lost your sound, I think. I'm going to turn to the Deputy Secretary General. Amina, the Secretary General's call for governments, business, civil society to work together to support the UN's efforts. How can the private sector support the UN in this time of crisis?
Well, thanks, Dan. First, let me thank Unilever, because the engagement you had with two of our agencies to see how collaborating brings a product into what already is in a supply chain was very important, and soap was just that. And the more creative and imaginative we can be, thinking about walking through what we say in our communities, and those supply chains are incredibly important. Where Unilever goods go or other goods go from other companies, sometimes government doesn't go and assistance doesn't get there. So I think the first thing is that let's actually map out where is business and where does it go and how can we join that and make sure that we get further to people who need it most. The UN, first and foremost, the new way of working is creating its own challenges. By taking people out of the workplace and saying we work from home means that we need connectivity. Now within the UN, in our country teams across over 130 countries, we're doing that really well. And we are taking care of our staff. Now, how do we engage with business, with government, with NGOs? I think those platforms need to be created really quickly. Those virtual engagement spaces, if you would, and to do it country by country. And we're working with the UN Global Compact to see how we can do that. But that could be something that business could help us set up really quickly. It's about connectivity, and it would be much appreciated. There's nothing worse than not being able to communicate with these great ideas and how we can solve these problems with the urgency which they require. I think that there needs to be a pushback from countries that are closing down the supply chains. Looking inwards, and that is going to be incredibly difficult, and it is going to deepen the crisis that we see in continents and regions where over 80–90% of their imports on the medical supplies exist with a dependency on that global trade and those supply chains. Companies need to say to governments, this is not right, and it will not work. And I think the principles that we talk about, and when we talk about human rights, this is a global issue that needs a global response. And so I'm hearing businesses' voices in trying to say, no, we will reestablish those supply chains. We will start to produce. I was really amazed this morning to hear one company that was producing the medical supplies for drips had now moved to sanitizers, had moved into other spaces where they had not expected to, but they saw the demand and they were upfront and trying to do that. It is important that we involve young people. They are the most creative, most connected, and give them the problem. They will resolve it really quickly. We have many entrepreneurs, and it is here a shout out for Southeast Asia, India, Africa. They're not waiting with a begging bowl. There are many people who are getting up and doing things. Hospitals are going up in stadiums all over Africa. It started there before it started here. So I think a little bit of respect and collaboration and co-creation around what needs to be done between businesses around the world and bringing them together. The UN, as I said, the platforms that we have in the country is an incredibly strong footprint of all our agencies, and we're willing to continue to connect, to convene, and to make this work in the collaborative way that it needs to be done. In the next week or so, you will see from the SG's report the framework in which we are developing to do that. It needs a structure. What is new? It's not just the UN. Business is being called upon. Government is in there at all different levels, especially the local level, because that's where the communities are, particularly those that I'm talking to you about that are out of the formal sector. So you don't even see them, but they are the glue for many of these societies. Communities that, when you talk about isolation, they live in compounds where they are many in number. So, as we say the things we do, we need to really reflect on what that means in practical terms for countries that perhaps can't shut down immediately, but could do the social distancing, could have different delivery mechanisms for goods and services, and in the meantime, make sure these collaborations ensure that we are better off down the road than we are now.
Thank you for your answer. You mentioned suppliers, supply chains. Alan, how are you supporting your suppliers, your supply chains? And one of the questions that we've had from many of the people in our audience is the questions around the small and medium-sized enterprises and how we can support those those smaller businesses was really, in many economies, a driving force of the economy nationally.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that in two ways. The first thing is, long before we got into this crisis, we've worked with what we call a global responsible suppliers code, where we've now audited 56,000 suppliers that we work with to make sure that they live up to many of the principles that Lisa outlined around making sure they respect human rights, pay people well, no slavery, etc., safety of their employees, operating to good environmental practices. And actually, we do that knowing that when we help our supply base to operate on those principles, they become stronger and intrinsically more able to withstand these kind of shocks to the system. More immediately, we are blessed with the strong balance sheet. Liquidity will be something we watch, but we don't feel threatened by. And as a result, we're able to use that. We've set aside 500 million euros for the purposes of paying our suppliers quicker than we ordinarily would. And in some occasions, extending credit to some customers and distributors. And the purpose of that will only be made available to small businesses, and the purpose is, frankly, to keep them in business. Of course, it's enlightened self-interest. We need that ecosystem. We need that infrastructure to keep running our company. But it doesn't hurt that it also helps to protect jobs and livelihoods. So our kind of framework on dealing of our whole response to this situation is, what can we do to save lives and what can we do to protect livelihoods? And some extra payment terms, paying our small suppliers quickly is a small thing we can do that might help.
Well, thank you. We are here to talk about leadership as well. I mean, what do you think some of the key competencies are that leaders need to lead their businesses, their small businesses, their governments, their communities through this time of crisis?
Is that for me, Dan?
Yeah, Alan.
Well, as you would expect, we've got a handy dandy framework on leadership competencies that we expect from leaders in Unilever. I can tell you, chief execs are expected to be proficient in things like strategy and systems thinking. At the moment, I'm getting very tactical. I'm living in the here and now. I'm trying to make the complex simple, give my teams clear principles to adhere to, and go for speed and decision making. But at the end of the day, contrary to often how it's portrayed, the chief exec is furthest away from the action on the front line, and we have to rely on our frontline leaders and team members. Our structure of thinking about leadership is a very progressive one, I think, and we talk about, you have to master your inner game before you can master your outer game. And this extraordinary uncertainty that we're dealing with at the moment is testing two dimensions of our inner game. The first is personal mastery. So anything you can do to remain centered, anything you can do to remain calm, not giving up on personal health and well-being. We're putting a particular emphasis on that. And the second is agility. We're finding that we're doing things in an order of magnitude faster than we ordinarily would do. So we're moving at 10 times the speed on decision making, on taking actions. We've stood up whole new factories to make we don't actually make hand sanitizer, or at least we didn't until 2 weeks ago. And we've stood up whole new factories to do that. We're designing right now a hospital in a box so that we can send ready to go containers to parts of the world that need extra hospital capacity, like Africa, to look after our employees. Things that we would have thought would take months, we're finding we can actually do in days. So personal mastery and agility.
Thank you. Lisa, the Global Compact's done a lot of work on leadership and leadership characteristics. can you say a few words about how you think leaders need to respond at this time?
Well, it's clear also from this conversation that personal leadership is making all the difference. So in order to cope with this pandemic or to make the 17 global goals a reality, we need amazing leaders in institutions across the world. If we zoom into business, we have done some research with Russell Reynolds, and it seems that when companies are searching for board of directors or for CEOs, it's only in quite rare cases that actually a holistic mindset, understanding of how to run a business in a responsible way are important parameters. I think now we have a great opportunity to change that, because clearly everyone can see in today's world that you cannot run a successful company in a world that isn't thriving, and that very important leadership capabilities going forward is going to be how you run your business in harmony with the world, and how you make the issues of the world your own business issues. Because we have so large challenges that it does require that everyone comes together in one big UN setting to try to deal with them. So my hope is that one of the things that will change, and one of the things we will learn from this situation, is that we need much more holistic, much more purpose-driven leadership to really manage and create a much more strong and a much more stable world.
Thank you. And Deputy Secretary General, I mean, what kind of advice or encouragement can you offer leaders at all levels of society coping with this terrible situation that we find ourselves in?
I think the first thing is not to think you're going to do things the same way you did them before with what is unprecedented and requires you to think differently. I think you need to remain present. It's really important. People want to see leaders, and they want to see them present, calm, and able, with a sense of urgency, to turn on a sixpence. That means taking risks, and I think those risks need to be measured, but you don't need to spend a week thinking about them. You need to get out there with a sense of urgency and a target audience that you know requires your response, whether it's your employees, or it is a community, or it is a government or a partner. They need you to respond and to fill that gap, for which there are many at the moment. I think so that does mean for a lot of us flipping the orthodoxies on everything that we do, and doing that together. I think this cannot be done alone, and I think the challenge that leaders will have is not to go alone because they think that they will be faster at it. This requires a huge lift, and so it needs competent hands all around, and leaders need to reach out to other leaders and really get that critical mass going. I think it also needs us to do two things. First, to be humble in the face of this challenge. I don't think that telling people or prescribing what it is that we're going to do is going to help us. As I said, everyone has a context in which they need you to come forward in offering whatever comparative advantage you have, so that we can collaborate and co-create the solutions together. Finally, I would say communication, communication, communication. Many people are talking about what they don't know, and I think that we need to fill that space, and it's a new space. Social media, and whatever media we find ourselves in, we need to know if the message is right. We need to think about the messenger. And in many cases, getting that right, getting into the space that you will be seen and heard is also important. I was on the G20 meeting the other day, and I think there were very high expectations of leaders there. The day after was very important. What did they do with the commitments that they made? And people are watching and they're listening. And for us at the United Nations, there is a concerted effort to make sure that the SG remains present and loud and clear about what we should be doing. What we need to do now is to transfer that to the country level, where businesses and business leaders, together with government, together with the UN, together with NGOs, are also finding their voice And I think hopefully we're creating a symphony of hope and of solutions that are being resolved rather than what has in the past been, a pretty bad cacophony.
Thank you. Thank you. Alan, you talked a bit about the, what comes next sort of following the crisis, and perhaps this is an opportunity to actually address some of the big challenges that perhaps we've failed to address and we're really feeling now. How do you think this is going to play out post-crisis? This is one of the questions that we've been receiving, live on the call as we've been talking. Briefly.
We believe that moral behavior is a path to better financial performance. We strongly believe that there is no contradiction between the doing the right thing and having a good top and bottom line performance. And I believe that this crisis will be an accelerator of that business model. The legitimacy of companies to exist and prosper will be measured increasingly by the impact that they have on the planet and on society. We're in the news today, again, being criticized for our plastic footprint. And frankly, we deserve that criticism. We're taking action on it. But I think that noise around corporate standards of conduct is only going to be amplified as a result of this crisis, as people realize how precarious everything really is in the world. Final point is just to agree with Amina that radical transparency and honesty in the communication of leaders, be they business leaders or political leaders, is the only type of communication that will be tolerated going forward.
Thank you. And Deputy Secretary General, you talked of this being a wake-up call for the world. How do you think the world will wake up?
Well, I think they already are. I mean, I think we're seeing some actions that are being taken, that people are looking about how to build back stronger health systems, because they are well aware that if they'd done this before, we wouldn't be facing the same kind of stresses and strains that we do. So we are seeing that in some of these stimulus packages, people are putting back money now into health that they hadn't done before. I think we're also seeing that people are saying, don't forget the frameworks and the agendas that we have today, because they haven't gone away. Climate change is still very much a big reality for everyone. So how can you integrate that into the work that we're doing now, so that if we talk about connectivity or energy transitions, that we can do that now, building back better before we get to the end of this. And so the 2030 agenda, the climate action agenda, still we're finding leaders keeping a hook in that, because that's something that we can't put on pause because of COVID. But maybe because of COVID, we can find the opportunities in this crisis. And, it is a crisis, it's a human one. And I think it does put us back to looking at the response that we have to take, putting human beings first. And I think, that's apparent across the world. It is one global debate, discourse, reflection, as we see the massive inequalities that have displayed themselves around the world in our inability to give everyone a fair chance at getting treatment, at a livelihood, and surviving the day.
Thank you. And Lisa Kingo, sorry we lost you. We lost your sound a little bit earlier, but what are your thoughts, very briefly, on how the business community will come out of this crisis, what it means for the way we've been operating, and how we can see a change in the way the world is working, and the contribution that businesses can make?
Well, I think that the last weeks has shown all of us as individuals that we are forced to reinvent our society. I don't think anybody has not been touched by the pandemic one way or the other. So in that sense, it has been a tough, but probably a good learning process. And I think it should illustrate to all of us that we do need a new way forward. And fortunately, we have that plan forward with the 2030 agenda, with the 17 global goals, underlined by the 10 principles. So I think the plan is there and we know what to do. And the learnings from the last weeks, I think, has shown us that problems don't go away. They have to be solved. And the moment to do that is now. Business, everyone in society, and all of us as one united world. Thanks,
Great.
Dan.
Well, I'm going to ask you one final question, and then we'll have to wrap up. It's a question that a lot of our participants have been asking on the Zoom chat, and that is about youth, the role of youth in leading us out of this crisis. Maybe just briefly from all of you, why don't we start with you, Alan, and then Lisa, and then the Deputy Secretary General. Just say a few words about the challenge that the younger generation is facing and their ability to help be part of the solution.
Two thoughts. The first is most of this crisis is going to require a lot of new ideas, new thinking, and most new ideas, certainly in our business, come from young people. And so young voices, young brains will for sure emerge as the originator of the best ideas coming out of this crisis. The second is it is the voice of youth that holds business accountable for the standards of conduct. We know our brands that operate with the high standards of purposefulness appeal disproportionately to young people, and that's just a symptom of how powerful the voice of youth is in making sure that business operates to high standards. So ideas and standards, young people will be the holders of both.
Lisa?
Well, young people are innovative, they have lots of energy, they work across borders in an amazing way that I think has never happened before. That's why at the Compact, we are running a huge Young Innovators program with all our local networks across the world, because we do know that it is the young people who should be allowed in and be heard and be invited to set the future agenda. So we are very keen to involve young people, to listen to what they have to say and to work with them in making some of these new and radical and very different ways of doing things a reality.
Thank you. And Deputy Secretary General, a final word from you on young people and their contribution to this situation.
Yeah, I mean, this is critical. I think that we all know what they can do. We've been saying this for the past 3 years since the 2030 agenda was framed. I think the litmus test is going to be whether we're going to engage them or not in the work that we do and not expect that they're going to do it down the road. So, you know, how we bring them in as part of those first responders on the socioeconomic piece with the solutions. If we are going to set up war rooms to address some of these solutions, to use platforms that for mobile money, for community engagement and delivery, all of this co-creative abilities that they have, we need to set those spaces up, engage them, and ensure that they are the first responders for that. It includes the health response. We need many more health workers in there. They're ready to engage, but we have to stop talking about it and make sure that we go out to these coalitions, we go out to these groups, associations, and we pull them into it. That'll be the litmus test. How many people did we really engage with young people going through this crisis, for which we're asking the world to be a better place the day after, and they should be shaping that. The second thing I would say that is really important, and I've seen again young people take the lead on this, that is mental health. We are facing an unprecedented challenge for which mental health has become an incredibly big challenge for us to try to deal with. And people need to find a space there to be listening to how can we have that online? I mean, there's telemedicine, but how do we do this with counseling? How do we help people out of that space go into the social media space to make sure that mental health is front and center on our agenda? Many people don't see tomorrow when they are isolated, and when we really need to shine a light on that and to make sure that people are connected. So on the mental health piece, we need different solutions for what young people are feeling and I hope that we will put something out on that as the days come forward. But this is, as I said, please, everyone take care of you so that you can take care of others. This is so, we are so interdependent in the actions that we take today, and it's clear that we must all be safe. But let's care about others. Let's also manage the expectations. As we work from home, those expectations should also be managed. You have, for the first time, families working 24/7 in the same small space and trying to manage with online learning, with getting on with your job. And I think all of this needs a sense of care and come back again to that we're humans first.
We're humans first. That's a very good place to end it. Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, for joining us, Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever, and Lisa Kingo, the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. Thank you to all of our audience. We've had an extraordinary global audience watching this session. We will be doing this again every week, starting on Tuesday at the same time, 10 a.m. New York time. We'll be talking to Guy Ryder from the International Labour Organization, together with the International Organization of Employers, Roberto Santos, and the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Sharon Burrow, about some of the labor issues. We've had a number of questions during this call, which we'll be addressing in upcoming sessions on labor and health, and supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. So with that, I'd like to remind everybody of our call to business leaders to follow the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact as a guide to inspire and to give inspiration to the way out of this situation that we find ourselves in. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.